Are unions to blame? Unions are accused of causing inflation, but unions cannot create new money and credit, so they cannot be held directly responsible for inflation. But just as business can exert pressure on government to inflate, so can monopoly wage increases. A good example is the credit the government created to bail out the Chrysler Corporation, largely to finance a labor contract that pays the employees twice the average industrial wage. But unions, like businesses, can only persuade a government to inflate if the inflation mechanism is in place. A redeemable currency would make this impossible. Inflation in the business cycle. The business cycle, which Marx maintained is inherent in capitalism, is actually caused by government inflation. New money is issued by the banking system under the aegis of government, says Dr. Murray Rothbard, and loaned to business. To businessmen, the new funds seem to be genuine investments, but these do not, like free market investments, arise from voluntary savings. The new money is invested by businessmen in various projects and paid out to workers and other factors as higher wages and prices. As the new money filters down to the whole economy, the people tend to reestablish their old voluntary consumption savings proportions. In short, if people wish to save and invest about 20% of their income and consume the rest, new bank money loaned to business at first makes the saving proportion look higher. When the new money seeps down to the public, it reestablishes its old 20-80 proportion, and many investments are now revealed to be wasteful. Inflationary credit distorted the market and misled the businessmen. Liquidation of the wasteful investments of the inflationary boom constitutes the depression phase of the business cycle. Expansion of the money supply also temporarily lowers interest rates, which creates malinvestment as well. Interventionist economists carelessly criticize the spreading of economic growth throughout a free market society as the trickle-down theory. But inflation, by trickling, then rushing through society, spreads economic misery among the poor, working, and middle classes, while enriching the special interest. It is this trickling down that deserves condemnation from everyone concerned about poverty. An increase in the money supply confers no social benefits whatsoever, says Dr. Hans Senholz. It merely redistributes income and wealth, disrupts and misguides economic production, and as such constitutes a powerful weapon in a conflict society. Whoever gets the new money first benefits the most, but the favored industry becomes dependent on new injections of government credit, and therefore forms a powerful special interest lobby to argue its viewpoint in Washington. Thus does inflation encourage the breakdown of society into warring factions. The guilt of the economist. Another outrage associated with inflation is the endorsement of the process by most economists. It's bad enough to see the beneficiaries promote wealth transfer through inflation, but to have the majority of 20th century economists do so as well is tragic. Some do so because they realize that their power and prestige depends on their giving an intellectual rationale to the acts of the inflation elite. But many do not benefit directly, and their motives may be good. But whether they promote inflation to help the poor, to help the rich, or just believe it is in everyone's interest, the results are horrendous. The interventionist economists who endorse inflation fail to accept the subjective theory of value, as formulated by the free market economist. This theory, without which it is impossible to dispel old economic myths, holds that the value of an economic good exists only in the minds of individuals, and that it can change with circumstances and over time. Prices and the production decisions which they determine cannot come from mathematical models and computers. Even the monetarists endorse sustained inflation, albeit at a lesser rate than is presently the case. The best-known monetarist, Dr. Milton Friedman, says the Fed should expand the money supply at 3 to 5% a year, the actual figure being less important than the absence of fluctuations. But even this amount of inflation inevitably introduces malinvestment, as those getting the new money put it to uses that only later recessions showed to have been unproductive. The Friedman approach may produce milder booms and recessions and less human suffering than present policy, but it nevertheless is inflationary and a product of the old discredited idea that government, rather than the market, should be planning the economy. Worst of all, it establishes the principle of government control of the money supply and would allow an increase in the inflation percentage if needed. The politicians and many bankers, union leaders, businessmen, and bureaucrats who profit from inflation are glad, of course, to have the intellectuals justify their fraud. It's unfortunate that economists who promote inflation are today called liberals, since a more illiberal and reactionary policy could hardly be imagined. They are also inaccurately called progressives, since inflation is an archaic device. Although today's coin clippers and debasers use sophisticated monetary arrangements to legitimize their acts, this makes no difference. Political, economic, and monetary turmoil still result. To promote inflation, the well-intended economist must blind himself to the economic dislocations and distortions that occur. Economic calculation becomes increasingly difficult every day, yet the promoters of inflation will not accept their responsibility. Inflation often leads to price and wage controls, which destroy the pricing system, the planning mechanism of the free economy. If these economists understood this, the only reason they could promote inflation would be to destroy freedom. Nobel Prize winner Friedrich von Hayek wrote in 1959 that it is no accident that inflationary policies are generally advocated by those who want more government control. The increased dependence of the individual upon government, which inflation produces, and the demand for more government action to which this leads, may, for the socialist, be an argument in its favor. All who wish to stop the drift toward increasing control should concentrate their efforts on monetary policies. The alternative to inflation. Inflation destroys the incentive to save, especially when there are government ceilings on interest, as with savings accounts. Our tax system, taxing illusionary income, worsens this, and we can expect to see a smaller and smaller amount saved by Americans. Inflation steals from those who still believe in thrift and robs pensions and retirement funds. How can any reasonable economist promote inflation with these facts staring him in the face? We have an opportunity to present to our people an alternative to the old, the failed, the tool of special interest, an alternative that is modern, that works, that benefits everyone. That alternative must be one that rejects inflation and dishonest money. It is a redeemable gold dollar. Money and the Constitution. It is apparent from the whole context of the Constitution, as well as the history of the times which gave birth to it, said Andrew Jackson, that it was the purpose of the convention to establish a currency consisting of the precious metals. The loss which America has sustained since the peace, noted James Madison in Federalist No. 44, from the pestilent effects of paper money on the necessary confidence between man and man, on the necessary confidence in public councils, on the industry and morals of the people, and on the character of republican government, constitutes an enormous debt against the state, chargeable with this unadvised measure, which must long remain unsatisfied, or rather an accumulation of guilt, which can be expiated no otherwise than by a voluntary sacrifice on the altar of justice of the power which has been the instrument of it. The emitting of paper money is wisely prohibited to the state governments, said Alexander Hamilton, and the spirit of the prohibition ought not to be disregarded by the United States government. Not only is inflation the result of the political demands of special interest groups, the career desires of politicians, and the ill-conceived motives of economists, it is also clearly unconstitutional. Money of real value, gold or silver, was clearly intended by the Founding Fathers, as evidenced in their writings and in the Constitution. Their abhorrence of paper money stemmed from their experience with the continental and irredeemable colonial paper money. That same abhorrence is becoming evident today as well, which is a healthy sign for those of us interested in developing a sound money system. Morality in transfer payments. If for no other reason, inflation should be rejected on the basis of morality. Inflation is taxation by deceit. Government deceives the people as to the tax burden and who is bearing it. The working and middle classes are gradually impoverished, while the poor are ground further down. Wealth is transferred to the rich from the hard-working and thrifty to the conniving and foxy. Inflation should be rejected by any society, but especially by one claiming a Christian Hebraic heritage. Not only is wealth transferred from one group of citizens to another in a giant anti-Robin Hood operation, but authority is transferred from citizens to the government. Monetary and economic decisions are increasingly taken from individuals and transferred to politicians, bureaucrats, and central bankers. To enforce the transfer, government officials accumulate power through legislation and regulation. Coercion becomes commonplace. Voluntary decisions are called detrimental to the whole, and freedom is gradually destroyed. Without a moral society, honest money cannot exist. Without morality and honest money, a free society cannot exist. An immoral society and dishonest money go hand in hand. Citizen control of money. The repudiation of debt through debasement of the currency is an ancient trick for not paying the bills. Default is at least done in the open. Inflation is much more destructive and dishonest, especially when the largest debtor, the government, controls the money supply. Adam Smith notes in The Wealth of Nations that when national debts have once been accumulated to a certain degree, there is scarce, I believe, a single instance of their having been fairly and completely paid. The liberation of the public revenue, if it has even been brought about at all, has always been brought about by a bankruptcy, sometimes by an avowed one, but always by a real one, though frequently by a pretended payment. Over the centuries, governments have used the theft of inflation to finance unpopular endeavors. In a free nation, adventurism at home with massive transfer programs or abroad with no-win wars would be impossible, since the people would simply refuse to pay the higher taxes or loan the government the necessary money. On the other hand, a popular cause will elicit the necessary funding through loans, donations, or taxes. Day of Reckoning. The day of reckoning is upon us. The people now recognize the inflation hoax for what it is and are demanding reform. Congress's responsibility is clear, but the choices are varied. We can continue down the rotted road of the past half-century, which will lead to monetary collapse and perhaps a new currency, as in Israel recently, and hundreds of times in other countries since 1900. But if the new currency is a fiat one, nothing will have been changed. We could take the monetarist advice and keep on inflating, but at a lower rate. But if 4% is good, what's wrong with 5% or 50%? If the growth in the money supply is to coincide with economic growth, what if there is a decline? Then the monetarists openly call for massive inflation. They still cling to the idea that wealth and productivity are somehow created by an increase in the number of monetary units. Some otherwise excellent friends of freedom promote this theory, but it offers nothing but economic and intellectual confusion. Whether the Federal Reserve, the Congress, or the bankers control the money system makes no difference. All inevitably abuse this control, which is why we need a money controlled only by the people. The only moral, constitutional, and economically productive alternative is the 100% redeemable gold coin standard, which puts the citizen in control. Some monetarists answer that gold has been abused in the past by government, but this is hardly an argument for a paper standard, since paper is infinitely more abusable. This is no different from arguing that since government has abused the right of freedom of speech, we should have no First Amendment. Free market money? Perhaps in the future we need to consider free market money, allowing consumers to decide about their money, the way they decide about everything else. Hans Sennholz and Friedrich von Hayek argue for this system, and it existed at one time in our country. In California, during the 1840s and 1850s, many privately minted gold coins circulated. The practice was outlawed in 1864, but as late as 1914, points out Anthony Sutton, the U.S. Treasury was still trying to halt circulation of private gold pieces in San Francisco. Why were such coins still circulating? Because the private mints maintained higher standards than the government mint. Often, points out Dr. Sutton, they were 1% heavier than federal issues to protect the user from metal loss by abrasion while the coin was in circulation. Private mints held to a higher standard because they were protected only by their reputation. They could not force consumers to take substandard money by the force of law, as government can. The North financed the Civil War with hundreds of millions of dollars of irredeemable greenback notes, and as a result, prices more than doubled from 1861 to 1865. During the greenback inflation, people in California continued to use gold as their money. In California, as in other states, points out Frank Tosick, paper was legal tender. That is, people could be forced to accept it. Although there was no antipathy toward the federal government, people believed strongly in gold. Every debtor had the legal right to pay off his debts in depreciated paper. But if he did so, he was a marked man. The creditor was likely to post him publicly in the newspapers, and he was virtually boycotted. Throughout the period, paper was not used in California. Legal tender laws. At the very least, we must repeal the legal tender laws that force people to accept the government's money and set up a gold coin standard impossible for the politicians and bankers to debase. We should also end the legal monopoly on banking, allow free entry, and make it an open, competitive business like any other. Legal tender laws tell people what they must accept as payment. If the government issues only sound money, such laws are unnecessary. But they become oppressive when government debases the money. When this happens, legal tender laws favor debtors over creditors. But only present debtors are benefited. Future would-be borrowers are penalized by the scarcity of credit created by inflation and legal tender laws. The central bank never set out to protect the integrity of our money. In fact, the Fed set out to destroy it by institutionalizing inflation. The gold coin standard was doomed, and today's inflation made inevitable the day the Federal Reserve was created. If government is to exercise monetary responsibility, it must be in establishing a 100% gold redeemable currency. And, notes William Rees-Mogg, the prize is very great. Good money, gold, restores reality to the payment for work and to saving. It permits not only the businessman, but every citizen to plan his economic life ahead and fulfill his own plans. It gives a real target not only to great ambitions, but also to humble ones. It provides a solid platform for democratic government. It brings inflation to an end. Above all, good money would restore the sanity, the limited and proportionate character of economic life. It would rid the world not only of inflation, but of the economic hubris which is worse than inflation itself. An historical precedent. Congress made the greenback notes redeemable in gold in 1879, and the effect of this action can help us plan for a similar action in the future. By the end of the Civil War, a greenback dollar was worth less than 50 cents in gold, but as it became obvious that Congress would redeem them in constitutional money, gold, they became worth more. The government also stopped inflating. By 1868, it only took $138 in greenbacks to buy $100 in gold, and by 1874, 111. Late in 1875, Congress passed a law saying that on January 1st, 1879, greenbacks would be redeemable in gold on a 1-to-1 basis, and the notes were to be retired gradually. As the date approached, says Dr. Donald Kemmerer, the price of $100 in gold in greenbacks declined from $111.50 in 1876 to $104.70 in 1877 and $101.10 in 1878. On December 17, 1878, 2 weeks before the official specie resumption day, the price of $100 in gold reached $100 in greenbacks. Dr. Kemmerer summarized the rather placid experience. The New York Herald relegated the story to page 3 and headlined it, "Resumption, an unexciting event throughout the country." There were flags flying from many buildings on Wall Street, and a Navy Yard battery at 10 o'clock officially announced the opening of the New York Sub-Treasury. This was the only place in the country actually required to exchange gold for greenbacks. Banks everywhere prepared to redeem greenbacks, however, as a matter of convenience. When the doors of the New York Sub-Treasury opened at 10, there were 15 clerks inside ready to serve the expected crowd. Behind the glass were piled immense quantities of gold and coins, all the way from dollars to double eagles. Actually, the crowd at the opening consisted of only one person, who demanded gold for his $210 of greenbacks. No one else appeared for another half hour. There were only about 15 or 20 people altogether before 1:30. But then the clerks had redeemed $3,000 in gold, the most frequently requested amount being $50. Technically, $50 was the smallest amount the Sub-Treasury was permitted to pay out under the Resumption Act. Some people came to the Sub-Treasury merely to collect monies owing to them by the government. Each was asked whether he wanted to be paid in gold or greenbacks, and most of them preferred greenbacks, which were easier to handle. One young man called at the Sub-Treasury and asked for $5,000 in gold. He got a bag of it, weighing about 17 pounds, and handled it somewhat carelessly. Gold eagles were soon rolling in every direction. After gathering and recounting them, he returned the gold and asked for some currency that will not roll about. The end or the beginning? Government's only legitimate reason for existence is to protect innocent life and property from aggression, foreign or domestic. When it deliberately destroys the money, government is acting perversely by harming innocent life and property. Short of intentional war, inflation is the most immoral act political leaders can commit. The legalized counterfeiting, which is inflation, must be ended now. The road to monetary destruction has been long and circuitous, but we are coming to the end of it. 67 years of central banking have brought us to the edge of depression and hyperinflation. But the foundations have been laid for a new monetary order. The spirit of freedom and the desire for honest money still run strongly among our people. In 1974, we reversed the unconstitutional 1934 law that barred private ownership of gold. In 1977, gold clause contracts were legalized. In 1979, a bill to repeal the Treasury's power to seize privately held gold was passed by the House. The minting of U.S. gold medallions has emphasized the importance of the people's right to own gold. Historic congressional hearings have been held on the gold standard, and an amendment to establish a gold commission passed both houses unanimously. The commission, composed of public and private sector representatives, will specifically study the role of gold in the domestic and international monetary systems. We must also work on halting massive gold sales at below market prices to European central bankers and Arab sheiks. If the administration is still intent on demonetizing gold with gold sales, let's at least sell it only in sizes that Americans can afford, 1, 1/2, and 1/4 ounce coins. Eventually, we must repeal the legal tender laws, which work only to the benefit of the government and other large debtors by forcing creditors to accept depreciated currency, and permit free banking. Federal Reserve notes must be made 100% redeemable in gold as of a fixed date and at a rate determined by the market price on that date. We also must balance the budget and pledge never again to expand the money supply. The argument that there's not enough gold to do this is false. With a gold dollar, a car might cost $600 instead of $6,000. But the exact amount of the medium of exchange used wouldn't matter. In a free market economy, points out Dr. Hans Sennholz, it is utterly irrelevant what the total stock of money should be. Any given quantity renders the full services and yields the maximum utility of a medium of exchange. No additional utility can be derived from additions to the money quantity. When the stock is relatively large, the purchasing power of the individual units of money will be relatively small. Conversely, when the stock is small, the purchasing power of the individual units will be relatively large. No wealth can be created, and no economic growth can be achieved by changing the quantity of the medium of exchange. It is so obvious, and yet so obscured, by the specious reasoning of special interest spokesmen that the printing of another ton of paper money does not create new wealth. Our freedoms are too precious to risk, and if we do not act quickly, we will see them perish just as surely as our currency. This is the ultimate justification for honest money. Freedom cannot long exist without it. By a continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate, secretly and unobserved, an important part of the wealth of their citizens, says John Maynard Keynes. As the inflation proceeds and the real value of the currency fluctuates wildly from month to month, all permanent relations between debtors and creditors, which form the ultimate foundation of capitalism, become so utterly disordered as to be almost meaningless, and the process of wealth-getting degenerates into a gamble and a lottery. Lenin was certainly right. There is no subtler nor surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction, and it does it in a manner which not one man in a million is able to diagnose. Many people have combed through every word of Lenin to no avail, writes Dr. Rothbard. He simply never said it. To do so, he would have to be a lot more familiar with sound economics than he was. Just another case where Keynes goofed. The consequences of monetary destruction are complex, but the solution is not. Without a moral foundation, a free society cannot survive. The same is true for our money. We will ensure a safe, secure, free, and productive America for ourselves and our descendants only by accepting both a moral defense of the free society and sound money. We may amuse ourselves, wrote William Gouge, Treasury Advisor, to President Andrew Jackson, by contriving new modes of paper banking. We may suppose that kind of money, which has been tried in various forms in China, Persia, Hindustan, Tartary, Japan, Russia, Sweden, Denmark, Austria, France, Portugal, England, Scotland, Ireland, Canada, the United States, Brazil, and Buenos Aires, and which has everywhere produced mischief, would, if we had control of it, be productive of great good. We may say it is true that paper money has always produced evil, but it is because it has not been properly managed. But if there is not something essentially bad in fictitious money, there seems to be something in human nature which prevents it from being properly managed. No new experiments are wanted to convince mankind of this truth. Since Mr. Gouge wrote this in 1833, we have had many melancholy examples to add to his list. Barter and the underground economy, which have already appeared in the U.S., are not the answers. Free people must not accept a retreat into primitive conditions. We must confront the enemies of freedom and honest money with superior ideas and superior determination. We can prevent the calamity only with the concerted efforts of many dedicated, well-informed citizens willing to put forth a Herculean effort starting today. The alternative to today's monetary fraud and tomorrow's chaos is readily available to us. The calamities that accompany monetary chaos have brought dictators to power in other countries. We must prevent this from happening here. People fight the gold standard, said Ludwig von Mises, because they want to substitute national autarky for free trade, war for peace, totalitarian government, omnipotence for liberty. It is no coincidence that the 19th century, a time of gold coin standards for the most part, was an era of peace. Nor is it a coincidence that the 20th century combines wars with paper money. Everyone who believes in freedom must work diligently for sound money, fully redeemable. Nothing else is compatible with the humanitarian goals of peace and prosperity.